This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, as well as the author of a new book entitled A Home for All Jews, Citizenship, Rights and National Identity in the New Israeli State, that was recently published in English by Brandeis University Press. Just like her recent studies, it seeks to tell a social history of Israel in the immediate aftermath of the establishment of the state. Dr. Orit Rozin, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad. How are you?
Welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review, I should say. Okay, so Israel has always been lauded as virtually the most successful social melting pot in modern history, having absorbed a population of migrants that was greater than its own, which more or less successfully integrated into the dominant culture. Now, my question to you is, how truthful is it, or is it just a myth?
I think the absorption of immigrants, it simply takes a long time. And since the influx of immigrants in the 1950s, especially between 1948 and 1951, was so great, we're talking about 650,000 immigrants and around 650,000 locals, local Jews, I should say. It takes time to be able to absorb, to negotiate some kind of mutual culture. And the beginning was all immigration waves was very, very difficult.
Yeah. And this is what really preoccupies you in your research, how the modalities of how these people gradually and slowly became Israeli.
Yes, but we usually think about, veteran Israelis absorbing the immigrants and inculcating their values to the immigrants, which is, the common story told. But what I've observed is that there's a kind of negotiation between immigrants and old-timers. And together, they don't have the same kind of power, but it's not correct to assume that immigrants did not shape their own life in a way. Mm-hmm. They had less power, but nonetheless, they had a lot of agency. Mm-hmm. And this kind of agency is what intrigues me.
Is it because they came from such a different background to the one that was... I don't even know if, the word being imposed on them is correct here, because as you said, it was much more complicated than that. But is it really the fact that they came from two worlds that were poles apart?
They came from many worlds. You had a huge group of survivors from the Holocaust, and they too came from different worlds. I mean, they were not from the same class. Some from Poland, some from Germany, some from different places, and different cultures and different levels of education. And then you had Jews coming from the Muslim world. Also, even the Jews from the Muslim world were very heterogeneous. You had someone, in my family, one of my mother's cousins married a doctor from Iraq. And you had illiterate, people who were illiterate, especially women illiterate from other places. So, yes, it was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And how was it all managed? I mean, tell us really about the nitty-gritty of that negotiation process.
Okay, so if we look at the immigrants, what the immigrants wanted is to have a voice, to have a say about what's happening in their lives. And since, the conditions were so harsh, the economic resources were very limited, no jobs, no housing, very limited health services. So the absorbers were, I would say, very rigid in a way because they were overwhelmed. Also, not just because they had a cultural inclination to be rigid, that too, because they wanted to shape the immigrants in their own image. And that obviously they were unable to achieve that. So the immigrants just, negotiated. If they did not like the housing allotted to them. They, a lot of times, refused. They would not embark from buses. They would go on demonstrations, sit-down strikes. They would use violence. They would threaten to commit suicide. I mean, it was very emotional, a very charged relationship.
Yet it was limited because it was never really translated into a political movement, because the dominance of Ben-Gurion and his party and his apparatus was overarching.
Yeah, but did they only use force to impose their views? And in a democracy, you simply don't have the resources. You don't have the will and you don't have the resources to do so. So this kind of image of the 50s where you have the immigrants and everything was dictated to them, and you had the lords of Mapai telling them what to do. This is just not how it happened. It's not how it went.
But was it really translated into even, a low scale, a small scale political movement? Were there any, political leaders, only locals, someone who tried to translate it into real political power?
I think first the opposition did its best to recruit immigrants to,
Opposition, you mean Begin and Chirut?
Any communists on the one hand and Begin and Chirut on the other hand. And all, everyone in the middle. And the religious parties, especially with Jews from the Muslim world, where they were more traditional. So religious parties had more say. So if we look at the 1951 elections, for instance, something that you did in my previous book, you see that in the immigrant camps, and especially in the ma'abarot, what we call transition camps, more immigrants voted for Mapai, but if you compare them to the general public outside, the transit camps, but if you look at what Hapoel HaMizrahi, which is like the religious party, gained, they had much more power over the immigrants than Mapai did, if you compare the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Because these people in the transit camps were more religious, so they actually spoke their language in a way.
Yes, but also because the transit camps were managed according to political... So coalition parties just divided the camps, and they had their own manager for the camp who was from this party or that party according to their ration in the government coalition. So, yes, you could see coercion, but at the minute this... the people get out of the camps and life change. You can see it, at least in 55, there's a shift towards Chirut, where there's the right in some locations.
Was any of that, I would say, protest against the dominant culture, was any of it informed, or were they really rejecting what was trying to, in some cases, be imposed on them? Or were they just, I'm talking about the immigrants, were they really shaping their livelihood according to what they could?
I would say, it really depends. Some people were quite informed, as you can see from the relationship. There's a group of Iraqi Jews going to the Knesset. They want to have an interview with the chair, with the speaker. And anyway, they get an interview. And you can see that they come with a petition, a list of demands, a very long list of people who signed their petition, and they negotiate. They're not intimidated by power, but they don't have overarching demands. They want things fixed. They want their lives, first of all, to get a life, a proper life.
An issue, a concept that is central to the book is that of citizenship. And again, it's the first one in the tagline, citizenship, rights and national identity. How do you define citizenship for the purposes of your study? And tell us also a bit about the modalities thereof.
Okay, so we usually think about citizenship as different from civil identity or from national identity, but for the people who lived in Israel at that time, the immigrants and the old-timers, it was one identity. You had to be a good citizen, meaning you're a good member of your national community, meaning this is your identity and you want to change stuff because you want to be part of this community, which is a national community. And when you look at that, when everything is welded together, you could see how segregated were the Palestinian Israelis, because they were just simply outside this circle.
Yeah, beyond the pale.
Yeah. So I think you could see a lot of writing on Ben Gurion's side on what does it mean, and it's very important for him to educate civil servants at how to be a good civil servant in order to promote good citizenship among the general audience or the general
contribution
public.
to the greater good? Is that what it means?
Not even that. It's just being civil in a way. It starts from very little things that you can't expect someone to come to your office and you don't offer him a chair and you yourself sit. Right. I mean, that kind of very basic humanistic respect. You are the state. You have to represent equality. You provide goods in the name of the state, so people have to understand that everything is allocated equally, that you're on their side, and you do your best in order to accommodate all their needs. So that was very minimal, very basic with, and an understanding that when a person comes and gets service, any kind of service from the state, this person who sits opposite him is the state.
Right.
So it's shallow in a way, but it's very, very deep.
It shows the extent
Exactly.
of the educational endeavor that the melting pot was. It wasn't just ideology. It was really all-encompassing in all walks of life.
Exactly. And it's not. He did not target only the immigrants, that they have to be educated. No, the civil servants had to be educated.
How much of that started before the establishment of the state? Because the Yishuv, it was called a state in waiting. It started at least 30 years before the Declaration of Independence, at least. To what extent was it a natural continuation of trends that already started before 48?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And the only thing I can say is when you look at this process, you can see that some traits or some law, you can see a lot of continuity, but a lot of change. And I think being independent did change a lot in the sense that you were accountable for everything. I mean, you, the government, everything. The Brits are not around to blame them.
There's no one to blame anymore.
No one to blame. It's all you. And that's huge responsibility. I think this is what leadership actually felt, and this is what they try to convey to their civil servants.
Was there anyone who actually coordinated that effort? I mean, Ben Gurion had this, imposing figure as a role model in many ways, and that too. But were there any other, I would say, apparatchiks who were responsible for that? You
can see within the bureaucracy, especially in the beginning, there's a lot of attention is being given to people who may be corrupt. I mean, they're very sensitive to that, to corruption. And indeed, there was a lot of corruption, even in the immigrant camps. People, because we had a very severe austerity regime with very limited access to food. Hence, people who were signed on allocating food to the immigrants in the transit camps some of them stole food. And that was a sensitive thing. But everywhere.
And were there commissioners who tried to fight corruption? Was it like a state-sponsored effort?
I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But I definitely saw a lot of cases where attention was being given to corruption, both within people of the judicial branch.
What role did the military play in all this? Because, first of all, it's a very effective mechanism for social integration all around the world, not just here. And it was idealized in many ways already back then. The military self-sufficiency of the new Jewish state, etc. Was the military really an important venue for the processes that you describe in your book?
I think it was very important. And I think also the military does its best to use, the manpower that is allocated to them. I mean, people are drafted and the army does the best to use them. It's a huge topic. I've not worked on that. But basically, I would say that it was a melting pot in a way, but also a place where people felt estranged. You could see both. I think it was better in a way. I have a student working on that. Jonathan Ben Shushan is working on Moroccan soldiers in the IDF
in the
during the
1950s.
war. Yeah, in the war. And after, and he thinks that while they were in the army, it was better when they were actually demobilized, discharged. And it was harder for them to adjust to civil society than within the army.
Because everything is clearer in the army.
It's clear, and also the army does its best to use its manpower, so they cannot reject them. They say, we don't want you. This is the manpower we have, and we use this method, that method, any kind of method to accommodate you. People can be coerced to a certain level. Definitely punishment is not, what the army doesn't want to incarcerate its soldiers. It wants to use them.
You mentioned Moroccan soldiers. I wonder, to what extent is the ethnic factor? To what extent is the ethnic factor important here and decisive?
This is also a huge question. What I've seen is that there's a major effort to include the immigrants. At the same time, while including immigrants, you exclude some of them. So I'll give you an example. In the first chapter of this book, I talk about the age of marriage law, which is law that was basically part of the influx of immigrants because especially the Yemenite community, there were many cases, or I don't know many because you can't actually count them, but it was clear that within this community there are cases of child marriage, even prepubescent girls. And this caused, a huge outcry and a need to legislate the law. And while there's a huge effort on the part of women's organization and the state and different branches of the state to embrace those girls, to help them, to release them from the marriage, to, find them a home or, and get to finish elementary school. When you notice that, you immediately blame the parents, usually the father, for marrying them off. So while you embrace those little girls and protect them as part of, being a modern nation and protecting childhood, you immediately look at the villains. Mm-hmm. And this is also a problem.
Yeah.
Because,
and did the families or the communities see the intervention of the state as some sort of harassment or even encroachment on their tradition and lifestyle?
Yes. Absolutely, especially that I found a petition of Yemenite rabbis, and they say, well, you allow, the age of consent was 16, the age of marriage was 17. So you say this, you go to the state, say you allow people to have sex without marriage, but you're making our daughters into prostitutes in their eyes. Now you have to understand that they come from a very different culture, and for them it's a tragedy. So.
Did the establishment address that at all? Or did they see them as villains?
No, actually, when you look at the courts, they really tried to walk, between
fine line, yeah.
Yeah, fine line. They understood that this is a different culture, and they basically wanted to educate the offenders, not to vilify them.
Right. And that is basically, the underlying theme of the whole process, as is expressed in your book. I mean, it's somewhere between an educational endeavor and a punitive one. Yeah,
but I would say it's much more educational than punitive, much more educational, because they understood multiculturalism was not invented then. So they had definitely sound view of right and wrong. I mean, I'm talking about the old-timers. But on the other hand, they were not completely ignorant or stupid, and they did not want to punish people for something that is basically cultural.
Right.
But they could not let that go unnoticed. So,
and it took a few decades until it was actually the process was complete.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also in many ways, the fact that Israel is now a buzzing democracy, with a multicultural democracy in many ways, with many groups with different backgrounds standing up to their own.
There's still a problem of underage marriage, though.
Okay.
But the difference is that, unlike the 50s, the fact that people are still married off, girls are usually still married off at a young age, does not cast a shadow over the state or the society. It just casts a shadow over this minority. In the 50s, this meant that we're not the bright, shining nation that we wanted to be.
Nation.
So this also shows you that the acts of one very small group, relatively, were taken very seriously because they were us.
Sure. All right, Orit Rozin, Professor of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University and the author of the recently published A Home for All Jews, Citizenship, Rights and National Identity in the New Israeli State. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, the sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
והאמת היא שכבר לא מתגעגעת, חיים שלמים הרי כבר באו אחרי, למדתי להילחם, למדתי גם